particularly France. And so in the Adams administration, we didn't declare war against France, but we fought this undeclared naval action for a couple of years. And Mr. Hamilton, and if I'm wrong about any of these details, I know you will tell me, but he, with George Washington, demanded an army to repel a French invasion of 50,000 strong. Well, nothing like that had ever been seen here. And eventually Congress, in its good sense, whittled that down to a provisional army of 10,000. It never saw action. But Mr. Hamilton insisted that he be named the Inspector General, the second in command of that army, and got his protector, George Washington, to make that a demand that President Adams could not afford to deny. And so in a certain sense, his patronage from George Washington enabled Mr. Hamilton suddenly to become the principal military officer of this country. But Adams was not in favor of a war, and impulsively he sent a second diplomatic mission to France in 1799, and in doing so, resolved the differences we had with France and ended this struggle, this Cold War. This offended the High Federalists, including Mr. Hamilton, and at that point, and I hope I'm quoting you accurately, sir, Mr. Hamilton suggested that because of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that we had passed here remonstrating against high-handed tactics during the Adams administration, that it would be convenient to march that provisional army through Virginia and Kentucky to intimidate the rebels of the Upper South. And he even said, I'm squinting at South America. He wanted to take a filibustering mission all the way to Peru and Venezuela to use his provisional army because he could hardly contemplate building an army and then not fighting someone with it. This was unpopular. And because of that unpopularity, and because of the Alien and Sedition laws of 1798, the election turned, and after 12 years of Federalist rule, Washington, Adams, but behind the scenes, Alexander Hamilton, the country in 1800, in what I called the Second American Revolution, retired these gentlemen from public life and put myself in as president, after me, James Madison, after both of us, James Monroe, 24 years of what's known as the Virginia dynasty. And so that Second American Revolution was, in some sense, precipitated by the high-handedness of that provisional army. The second thing is even more remarkable, and that is that when President Adams began to shut down that army, he was never someone who admired Alexander Hamilton. He was rude to Hamilton. And they had a famous confrontation in the president's office. And afterwards, Mr. Hamilton, who was a man of a very strong sense of personal honor, was so outraged by Adams that he went away and he wrote a 54-page pamphlet in October of 1800, just weeks before the election, attacking John Adams, the sitting Federalist incumbent of his own party, attacking Adams as a man wholly unfit for the presidency. 54 pages. Even his closest friends thought that this was the most insane and self-destructive thing that Alexander Hamilton had ever done. It effectively cost John Adams re-election in 1800. It ended once and for all Mr. Hamilton's political aspirations, and it hastened the death of the Federalist Party. By 1808, when I retired from the presidency, the Federalist Party was a nullity. It had disappeared from American life after being the party that created this country in 1787. That doesn't all owe to this impulsive pamphlet, but a great deal does. And it gets just one step worse. After every one of Mr. Hamilton's friends said, "Why did you do this thing?" This was the most self-destructive thing that could ever have been done for the Federalist Party. Mr. Hamilton wanted to do a second edition with more anecdotes about Adams. He was collecting more material for an expanded second edition of the pamphlet. And then finally, as you may know, that in 1800 we were not yet differentiating the ticketing for president and vice president. So whoever got the most number of votes in the Electoral College became president. The person who got the second most number of electoral votes became vice president. Thus, in 1796, Adams had been elected president. He was a Federalist. I got the second most number of votes. I was therefore vice president, even though Adams and I didn't agree about much. We weren't of the same party. We weren't on the same ticket, but that's how the system worked. In 1800, everyone in the country knew that I was the presidential candidate of the Republicans, and everyone in the country, there were about 6 million of us, knew that Adams was the incumbent candidate of the Federalists, Adams v. Jefferson, and that my vice president would be Aaron Burr of New York. When the electoral results were read in early December of 1800, it turns out that I had defeated John Adams, 73 votes to 65. He was now retired to Massachusetts. But I had tied with Colonel Burr. We each had 73 votes. Now, there wasn't a single American who didn't know that I was president and Burr vice president, but the Constitution didn't know that, because the Constitution saw a tie. When this happens, the election is thrown into the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives that was to sit in judgment of this was an outgoing, discredited, Federalist, lame duck House of Representatives. And they despised me. They regard me as a dangerous Jacobin, a man Frenchified in his manners, a man who was given to flights of philosophic fantasy. One of the Federalists said Mr. Jefferson would be an outstanding president of a university, but not the president of a republic. They did not want me to be president. And so these lame duck Federalists actually flirted with Colonel Burr and said that if he would cooperate with them, they would put him in the presidential chair in my place. If this had happened, it might have produced civil war. But here's the interesting thing. Mr. Hamilton didn't like me. He regarded me as a very dangerous man. He can tell you what he wrote in several letters of this period about my character and my philosophy and my manners and so on. But he disliked Aaron Burr even more. And he wrote indefatigably and talked to anybody he could, especially amongst the moderate Federalists, to say, Jefferson is dangerous, but Burr is a disaster. In short, he said Jefferson, for all of his problems, is a man of character and the lesser of two evils. And that turned the election. Eventually, the moderate Federalists said, however much we dislike Jefferson, he was elected, and if Hamilton says Jefferson should be put in that office and Burr is not to be trusted by any rational human being, then we will reluctantly install Jefferson as the third president of the United States. So, sir, I thank you.
I can see you like Mr. Jefferson's history much more than you like my vision for the United States of America. Let me just say, if the shipyards close down, you'll change your mind. I hardly know where to begin. I was just defended by Mr. Jefferson, who used history in a way that I've never quite seen it done, but I believe you understand a problem that I had after my death. I died, of course, in 1804. My two greatest political enemies, Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Adams, both died on the same day, July 4th, 1826. That left them 22 years to say anything they wanted to about me. And they availed themselves of that opportunity greatly. And my story has been told by people who didn't like me. Particulars of what Mr. Jefferson was saying were true. Aspects of what he said were not true.
Which parts? I would like to know if I were in error, because I was really trying to be very fair.
Sir, I'm trying to be gentlemanly up here. I did not interrupt you.
I'm actually asking you to clarify the errors that I have made.
I'm having deja vu all over again, although the roles are reversed. I don't want to get into a discussion of your view of my history. One simple example, I became the Inspector General of the Army because General Washington, who Adams wanted to be the head of the Army, was in no position. He was an old man. There was no way that he could actually field an army, raise an army, train it, and make sure it was ready for battle. His choices among the most senior officers of the American Army were also Revolutionary War generals. They were a great deal older than I was. I was the only one with the youth, the vigor, and quite frankly, the abilities to form an army. And General Washington insisted that I be the Inspector General of the Army over the objections of John Adams, who did not like me at all. We had little use for one another. So that's one instance. You claim that I convinced Washington to make me the Inspector General. General Washington cared more about his reputation in this country than about any two other things. And he would not have threatened his reputation by allowing me to sequester myself in the folds of his camp again, unless he believed I was the very best person for the job. Did I want to attack South America? Did I want to march through Virginia? These are the kinds of innuendos and half-truths that have been perpetuated through the years, and I was, of course, in no position to defend myself. But rather than talk about this kind of thing, I think it's much more important that we look at America and what sort of country you want to live in. And I assume you're here tonight because you believe that we who lived in a different time can provide you some insights that will be useful to you. And at the risk of paraphrasing Mr. Jefferson's own views, let me just say that his presidency was a dangerous time in American history. We were woefully unprepared for military action, although he was the first to bloody our modern Navy. It was a difficult time, but he would have you believe that Colonel Burr, behind the scenes, agreed with certain Federalists in order to be considered for president. There is no evidence that Burr did that. There is, however, evidence that Federalists approached Mr. Jefferson, and in return for his agreement to maintain our funding system and other certain essentials of the government, he got Federalist support. Interesting how that didn't come out as we were discussing that topic. History, of course, is told by people who are not lacking in self-interest. Mr. Jefferson spent a great deal of time as an elderly man making sure that the historical record that he left behind would allow you to see him just as he wanted you to see him. There are many things that did not make it into that historical record. I, on the other hand, was championed by my wife, who survived me by 50 years, and who gathered up all of my papers and did everything that she could to ensure that my reputation would be enhanced. She even went so far as to sue one of my best friends during my lifetime, Rufus King, in order to obtain from him papers that proved that I had authored Washington's farewell address. Rufus King, Federalists, Democratic Republicans, many people believed that that news would be so offensive to the people of this country that it couldn't survive it. What? That I worked in conjunction with General Washington? We had done that throughout the war. That we had a unique sort of understanding that I was the perfect subordinate to him and he was my aegis? Well, such was the world that Mr. Jefferson presided over. People did not want you to know that I had done things on behalf of this country that were crucial and critical for its success. And they were not just my political enemies. In some cases, they were my dearest friends. I once said, this American world is not for me. I have done more than any other to prop up our frail Constitution. And in return, I have not only the ranting of my enemies, but the murmur of my friends for thanks. Study the founding generation, and you will find no one else who did any more to sacrifice for this United States. I was maligned as a person who was stealing from the Treasury Department, speculating in government funds. The Democratic Republicans engaged in forcing me to have reports presented before the House of Representatives that would demonstrate that nothing was amiss in the Treasury Department. Never was a cent found out of order. When Mr. Jefferson became President of the United States, he asked his Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, to peruse the records of the Treasury Department. He was sure that there would be many examples of my wrongdoing and my stealing the public monies. And Gallatin returned to Mr. Jefferson. I'm sure you remember when Mr. Gallatin came to you and he said, "Sir, not only are there no problems with our financial system, Hamilton never took a cent, but it is the most perfect financial system that has ever been devised." Thank you. You are showing good sense. Much has been done since then to weaken it, things that I could not anticipate, the destruction of the National Bank, which was an incredibly important resource. Here again, I don't think Mr. Jefferson had the same concerns about the threat of war that General Washington and I had. We were fearful that we were ripe for European takeover. And a bank was a great way, a national bank was a great way for a nation to be able to borrow a great deal of money in a hurry in order to manufacture the kinds of supplies and necessities that would enable an army to stand in the field. We never again wanted to be in the place that we were in. I repeat myself, during the Revolution, when literally General Washington, and I usually wrote the letters, would beg continental governors, including Mr. Jefferson, for support for our troops in the field. Support that too often was not forthcoming. I truly do not understand